IEA blended personnel from both political parties, Harris and Fisher from the Tories, the Conservatives, in other words, Selden and Smedley from Liberals. The result was a new kind of conservatism based on classical liberalism. Uh, and then Harris and Selden used their working class origins to paint Keynesianism as elitist. So yeah, this sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier when, you know, neoliberalism kind of resulted in this fusion of liberals and conservatives into like this new force, right? Liberals, like economic liberals, otherwise known as neoliberals. Like this book uses the term economic liberals a lot. It doesn't ever use the term neoliberals, even though I think it should. It just goes with the term economic liberalism. Um, but you have these economic liberals, right, who get frozen out of the Liberal Party, and these conservatives who just join forces to create like this new political entity called the Institute of Economic Affairs. And their goal is not to influence one particular party or another. It's to influence the entire political spectrum, to infect all the political parties currently operating with their ideas. That's for the neoliberalism series, right? Is this like the final vid for the series? No, it's far from the final video. My intention is for there to be at least 12 episodes, and this would be number 6. So I'm, in a sense, about to reach the halfway point. Because yeah, the intention is to arrive all the way at the present moment, and we're still like in the middle of the 19th century. Like this is gonna cover the era between like probably like 1945 to like 1970 something, this next episode. So yeah, there's still quite a lot of work to be done, and I'm kind of working at a snail's pace right now, just because this is like my 14th month of being quarantined, and I'm still furloughed from my job. So my concentration is not what it used to be, but I'm still trying. Just so that you're aware, I made these notes about chapter 4 of this book last week, although I didn't stream myself doing that. And also, if you go to this folder over here, I made these new sections called articles and books. So if you go to articles, you can find this this article that I found. It's called "The New Right: A Critique." This is one of the first articles I've ever read that actually identified neoliberalism, but like before it took power. It was basically like a warning saying like, you know, these guys are not fucking around. But he recognizes them as the new right. He doesn't recognize them as neoliberal. I don't think he used the word neoliberal once in here, although I might have to reread it just to make sure about that. But yeah, this is an article that was referenced at the end of the 4th chapter of this book, so that's how I found it. So this is like a very interesting article because it will give you insight into like how some people on the left were like observing what was happening with all these like new talking points coming out of people like Hayek and Mises and stuff like that, and all these think tanks that were like sprouting up and being like, this is kind of a problem. And like the left is still talking about like, how do we further nationalize or control the economy when it's like dude, we're about to get steamrolled by these dudes that are making waves over here. And I don't think they listened to him. But yeah, this was a really fascinating article. How old is that book? Never even heard of that book. This is not a book necessarily. This is an article. So this is a Fabian tract. And the Fabian tracts are like these little articles that get published by the Fabian Society, which is kind of like a socialist society that the Mont Pelerin Society modeled itself off of, except they modeled themselves as like an anti-Fabian society, right? They hated the fact that the Fabian Society was so successful at spreading socialist ideas, and so they just formed their own society to try and counteract the Fabians. So these were like articles that would be published by the Fabian Society periodically, and this was one that came out in. Okay, so this Fabian tract, it came out in 1968. So in 1968 is when this guy David Collard wrote this article for the Fabian Society. I'd say this was like 12 years before the neoliberals took over, right? So 12 years before the neoliberals took over, this article came out, and he was like, "Hey, these people are doing a lot. They're making a lot of points here, and no one is really taking them seriously." So yeah, I find this article to be super fascinating. I think that this deserves a mention in the upcoming video. I'm guessing he wouldn't be far off in terms of how the left is pretty much the right party today. I don't think that that was his point in this particular article. I think the point of this particular article was like I could just look in the book. Actually, the book has a block quote that is the one that I'm looking for. It's just a page backwards. He says, "The new right must be respected for the quality, consistency, and rigor of its approach to the treatment of private industry. In this sense, it is rather unfair to lump it together with organizations such as Aims of Industry." Aims of Industry was like this. It was basically like this trade association for big industrialists that was like kind of nakedly plutocratic. I mean, you could argue that the neoliberals were also nakedly plutocratic, but their method was to actually make the intellectual case for plutocracy. It was like they were being very academic about it. Um, the economic vision of the new right is the economists. Can I say the fucking word right? Economist model of perfect competition, in which rational consumers indicate their preferences to profit-seeking producers by means of prices under conditions of perfect information. This is very far removed from a crude approach based on the vested interests of capitalists. So the point that he's making here is like he's not being like the neoliberals, or what he calls the new right, basically the think tanks like the IEA and the Hayeks and Mises and Milton Friedmans of the world. They're making a very intellectual, very academic case for free markets. They're not just saying things like, oh, capitalism, the interests of capitalists, are overriding the rest of society. Like, they're not being that explicit. They're being a lot more indirect. And they're trying to make an academic and intellectual case for lifting restrictions on markets and trying to make it like basically like a scientific fact that this is how economies should be run, right? It's they're trying to appear as non-ideological as possible, even though there's still an ideology behind it, obviously. That was his point in that block quote. Yeah, I'm probably not going to get through this whole chapter in one stream. I feel like this might be the end of my ability to actually do a whole chapter on a stream in this book. Because, like, yeah, once I got to chapter 4, I was like, okay, I don't think that I can actually do this on a stream anymore. I think I'm just going to have to buckle down and just take lots of notes. I think that this chapter is going to be the same way. But what we can do is, because I already completed the notes of chapter 4, we can actually go over this, because there's a lot to talk about with this chapter. So if y'all have been in some of my previous streams, you know that the focus of this book is on the Institute of Economic Affairs, right? But the founder of the Institute of Economic Affairs was this guy named Anthony Fisher. And this 4th chapter goes into detail about Anthony Fisher and how he actually did that, how he actually founded this think tank. Can I get the name of that book again? The name is Thinking the Unthinkable, Think Tanks in the Economic Counter-Revolution, 1931 to 1983, by Richard Cockett. It was very expensive, just letting you know. So, but what I can show y'all right now is these notes that I took on chapter 4. And there was a lot of stuff to talk about. So, Milton Friedman described Anthony Fisher, founder of the Institute of Economic Affairs, as the single most important person in the development of Thatcherism, despite Fisher being mostly unknown publicly. So, if Friedman says that you're the single most important person to develop Thatcherism, that's kind of a big deal, right? But most people don't know who this guy is. Most people don't know who Anthony Fisher is. And that's what this chapter was all about. So Fisher is one of these guys who, like Harold Leno in America, he underwent this political transformation after reading the Reader's Digest condensed version of The Road to Serfdom, right? And he's not even the only person who underwent a transformation just by reading this work, right? Which I think should signal to you how powerful this book was for a lot of people. Like, just reading this book by Hayek was enough to just like give their lives a completely new trajectory, right? To the point that uh, Anthony Fisher actually sought out Hayek when he was a lecturer at the LSE to get his advice. So Fisher met Hayek in the LSE in his LSE office in 1947. The meeting changed the trajectory of Fisher's life and career. Fisher asked Hayek what he should do to tilt policy discussions in Britain away from collectivism and towards free market competition. Hayek said to avoid wasting time in politics and instead create a scholarly research organization to supply intellectuals, universities, schools, journalists, and broadcasters with studies on economic theory and practical application of free market politics. So Hayek provided Fisher the mold for the Institute of Economic Affairs, which went beyond the bounds of what Hayek recommended at the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting, right? So at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting, which took place later that year in April, like Hayek argued to his colleagues that they had to transform culture, right? And they had to do this decades-long transformation uh, of like undoing the accomplishments of the socialists and the collectivists and the government interventionists and the Keynesians. Um, but I mean, he didn't go as far as what he said to Fisher, right? What he said to Fisher was like, you need to literally start a research foundation, a research organization, right? He didn't go that far in the Mont Pelerin Society meeting. So his advice to Fisher was actually more aggressive than what he suggested to his own colleagues at the Mont Pelerin Society. And then Fisher attended his first Mont Pelerin Society meeting in 1951, which I think at that point had to have been like the third meeting, because I think they have meetings every 2 years. Fisher also published a Hayek-inspired book in 1947 called The Case for Freedom. The book attacked the fixed exchange rates and the Bretton Woods system, right? That's a very early attack on the Bretton Woods system, which had just been founded like a couple years before. Fisher became more active in conservative groups after meeting with Hayek and built up his farming business. So Fisher was a farmer, right? And he was an entrepreneur. But his career really took off when he actually went to America and went to the Foundation for Economic Education, right? The organization that I was just talking about. So Fisher's professional life was transformed when he was invited by Floyd A. Harper, who is also a Mont Pelerin member, to visit the Foundation for Economic Education in 1952. Fisher learned broiler chicken farming techniques in Ithaca, New York, which made him a fortune when he brought those techniques to Britain in 1953. Fisher also absorbed the free market education program of the FEE, which provided the model for his own think tank. So, like, Hayek gives him the idea that he should start a think tank, but when he goes to the FEE, he actually sees an organization like his in practice, right? Which sort of gives him the idea for how it should ideally function. So, like, this trip to America completely changes his life, right? He goes back to Britain, starts a chicken farming business, makes a complete fortune, and then uses that fortune to start his own political think tank. And then, okay, so this is where Oliver Smedley comes into place. So what's really hilarious about this book is like the way that I found this book right here was because someone, I don't remember who it was, they dropped Oliver Smedley's name in the chat. And so we went to Oliver Smedley's Wikipedia page because I was trying to figure out who that is. And in the reference section of that Wikipedia page, I found this book, right? So someone in my own stream who dropped this name, Oliver Smedley, into my chat room is what led me to this book, right? So this is kind of like coming full circle to how I actually discovered this book in the first place. So Fisher relied heavily on Oliver Smedley, someone he met in the Society of Individualists, to set up the IEA. So Society of Individualists was like this precursor to a lot of neoliberal organizations that was founded like way back, I think in like the 20s or 30s. So this was like before, I don't know, maybe even before World War II started. I'm not sure. I would have to double check that. So Smedley was even more fervently pro-market than Fisher himself. Smedley was a paratrooper in World War II. Smedley was already involved in several free market campaigns by 1952. So this is a really important point for a lot of reasons, because the way that politics transformed in the 20th century kind of led to this realignment where some of these terms like liberal and conservative started taking on completely different meanings than like what they had originally been used for, right? So Smedley and Fisher and Hayek and all these guys, they consider themselves to be economic liberals, right? And they can also be described as neoliberal, right? If you believe my series. Um, but the Liberal Party in Britain was thoroughly controlled by Keynes and Beveridge, right? The Keynesian revolution had taken control, right? And so no one in the Liberal Party gave a shit about like economic liberalism or free trade or, you know, private sector. You know, no one gave a shit about any of that. So like these so-called economic liberals and neoliberals, they got frozen out of the Liberal Party, right? They didn't have any influence anymore, which meant that they actually turned to the Conservative Party to find an audience, right? And this is where you get this weird nexus of individuals who call themselves liberal, but end up going into the Conservative Party and fundamentally transforming the Conservative Party in a way that eventually leads to Thatcherism, right? So the fact that this Conservative Party is still called a Conservative Party at all, you know, after these guys infiltrated them, it is kind of like a misnomer, right? Because they cease being a conservative party, you know, in the sense that, you know, the only thing that made them conservative was like this nationalist militaristic impulse, right? This imperialist impulse, right? But when it comes to economics, like they were very economically liberal, right? It's just that they got frozen out of the Liberal Party. Like Keynes and the influence of Keynes and Beveridge were too strong. They had no voice in that party anymore. Um, When Fisher proposed the creation of a research institute, Smedley and his groups were very receptive. Smedley actually suggested the name Institute of Economic Affairs. So that name actually came from Smedley, which is why I thought it was really important that I figure out who this guy is. So Fisher was clear with Smedley that the aim of IEA was a Hayekian strategy of long-term intellectual persuasion, not direct political action like Smedley was used to. So like I said earlier, Smedley, he was very active in the Liberal Party, right? He was used to doing direct politics, direct action. And Fisher, when he made this proposal to start the IEA, he was like, look, you're going to have to stop doing all this direct action stuff because the work of the IEA, it has to appear as nonpartisan as possible. And that was really important for a couple of reasons. The first was that Hayek convinced Fisher that the only way that rolling back the New Deal and British welfare and nationalization is ever going to work is if you undertake this decades-long process of slowly persuading the political and intellectual classes with like very rigorous academic research that free markets are superior, right? There's no way that you're ever going to achieve this lasting impact with direct political action. You have to like circumvent the entire political system by just creating this huge stockpile of academic research and policies that eventually will get noticed by the political classes, right? So, and Fisher was totally on board with Hayek's strategy. He was like, you know, I think that that's the way to go. And so Fisher was clear with Smedley that this is what had to happen. And then Fisher modeled the IEA on the Fabians and early socialists. And then I made a note that Fisher had a block quote to Smedley in this book that is really good that I didn't want to just copy down the whole quote because it would have taken too long. But this is like a consistent theme for the neoliberals, right? The neoliberals look at their adversaries, they look at the Fabian Society, they look at the socialists, they look at the Keynesian interventionists, and they're like, wow, these people were so successful at like creating this huge impenetrable consensus around the need to intervene in the economy. We need to learn from them. We need to adopt their tactics, and we need to use their own tactics against them, right? So these neoliberals like Hayek and Fisher, they looked at the Fabians, right? And they were like, how do we accomplish the same thing as the Fabians? So the IEA is actually modeled on a lot of Fabian tactics, right? The Fabians, like I said earlier, they had this routine where they would publish Fabian tracts, which are like these short articles that are written in very understandable prose that explain like socialist and interventionist philosophy. And the articles that came out of the IEA were like very similar. They were very short articles in very understandable prose that, you know, would attack any realm of the economy, whether it was like pensions or specific industries like telephone or gas or iron or steel, and explain why private sector solutions were always superior. Uh, and then Fisher and Smedley stressed IEA work was non-party political, meaning it could claim charitable status and receive tax-free donations. And this was the real reason why nonpartisanship was so important, right? Because the IEA, by claiming to be non-political or nonpartisan, it could claim charitable status and receive tax-free donations, right? And that's the way that it survived, was by donations by like very wealthy individuals who wanted to keep it going. So the IEA was formally founded on November 9th, 1955. So if you think about it, the IEA was founded only 10 years after the conclusion of World War II. And it was the single most important institution responsible for the collapse of the post-war era, right? This organization that was created as a result of a collaboration between Hayek and Fisher. This organization probably did the most work to actually erode and eventually destroy embedded liberalism, right? Because without the IEA, there's no Thatcher. Without the IEA, there's probably no Reagan either, right? Because all the think tanks that sprout up in America are based on this think tank, right? Heritage Foundation is based on this think tank, right? So without IEA, you don't have the neoliberal revolution that occurs in 1980 or 1979, right? This organization right here is the single most powerful organization that's responsible for the collapse of the post-war era. So IEA's first ever publication, The Free Convertibility of Sterling by George Winder, Fisher sent a copy to Henry Haslet, who covered it in his Newsweek column. So Henry Haslet is someone that I haven't covered in the series yet, but he's a super important figure because he's probably the most important journalist that the neoliberals have in their corner, right? Haslet was this guy who wrote for like all the biggest publications in the U.S. He wrote for the New York Times. He wrote for Newsweek. I'm pretty sure he wrote for Reader's Digest. He might have written in like the Wall Street Journal. I mean, this guy was everywhere. And Haslet was like a disciple of Ludwig von Mises, right? So Haslet was like a huge Mises fan. And this guy did so much work popularizing the works of Hayek and Mises in America, right? So the fact that Fisher sends this guy a copy of the IEA's first ever publication, like that's a pretty good indication that these guys like all knew each other. They all had a plan for how this was going to go down. So Fisher offered the job of director of IEA to Ralph Harris in 1956, who he met in 1949. So Fisher meets this guy named Ralph Harris in 1949, and he tells Harris, like, yeah, I have this idea to start a think tank. It's going to be like an anti-Fabian society. And I'll tell you when I get it up and running. And it isn't until 7 years later that Harris actually gets a response from Fisher and is like, and Fisher's just offering him the job. Like, hey, do you want to be director of the think tank that I told you about 7 years ago? So like he came through on that promise. And then Ralph Harris was taught by Stanley Denison at Cambridge. Denison introduced Harris to the works of Hayek, including the Intellectuals and Socialism. So Stanley Denison, this is a guy whose name I've read in so many different works, but I still don't understand very much about him. I'm pretty sure he was one of the only like anti-Keynesians who still taught at Cambridge, right? Because Denison taught at Cambridge, but Cambridge was like Keynes's home base, right? So this guy is one of the few people at Cambridge who actually doesn't like Keynes. And this guy introduces so many people to the work of Hayek. Like, I'm pretty sure Harris is just only one of his students. He had dozens of students who ended up going to work in these think tanks and eventually like serve in the Thatcher administration, I'm pretty sure. Harris went to work for the Conservative Party after his education. Fisher saw Harris speak at a conservative political center meeting in 1949. And then, yeah, this is where he tells Fisher about his plans, or he tells Harris about his plans. Harris lectured on economics at St. Andrews University before being offered the job of director of IEA in 1956. He started his job on July 5th, 1956, and worked at IEA for over a decade. So the conservatives were the perfect host to pass on the virus and make it spread. That's how it worked in practice. I mean, the way that it happened was very convoluted, but it ended up working, right? Because, like I said earlier, these economic liberals, they got frozen out of the Liberal Party in Britain, right? The Liberal Party had wanted nothing to do with them. The Liberal Party was all about Keynes and Beveridge, right? So these guys had to find a different audience if they were going to have any hope of reintroducing economic liberalism or neoliberalism into the system. And I think the chapter that I'm on now is actually going to go into a lot more detail about why the conservatives actually made the ideal audience. And based on what I've read so far, it's really because like the conservatives have a string of failures and setbacks in the early 1960s that really starts making them question their approach to politics in Britain. And that's when they discover the IEA. And they're like, okay, these guys are pumping out information like crazy. Like maybe we should listen to these guys because clearly what we're doing is not working. So in the early 1960s is when the conservatives really start to notice the IEA. Um, but up until then, the IEA is basically just working in obscurity. Like no one gives a shit about them. Arthur Selden was then recruited to be IEA's editorial director in 1957 to aid Harris. Selden was a socialist before being converted to economic liberalism at LSE under Hayek, Robbins, and Plant. So Selden is just another example of one of these guys who starts out with a leftist background, and then he goes and studies under some neoliberal like Hayek and Robbins and Plant at LSE and gets converted, right? It's impossible to overstate the influence of these neoliberal academics like Denison, Hayek, Robbins, Plant. I mean, every time you read about these guys, you learn about how influential their students became in the whole world of neoliberalism, right? So Selden was just another student of these guys. And then, like Smedley, Selden was drawn to the IEA by the perceived failures of the Liberal Party to combat collectivism, right? So again, the Liberal Party is viewed as a dead end for economic liberalism. They don't have any influence in the Liberal Party anymore because Keynes and Beveridge are just dominating. Uh, Harris and Selden effectively ran the IEA from 1957 to the mid 80s. So Harris and Selden, these guys are like a dynamic duo. Harris is sort of like the front man for the organization. He's the director, he's the salesman, he's the really eloquent speaker. And then Selden is like this super meticulous researcher, this very detailed editor, and a really like expert writer who like really does a lot of the trench work of like writing these pamphlets and articles that uh, really like raise the status of the IEA. Fisher and Harris had a falling out with Smedley shortly after the IEA was founded due to Smedley's continued links with the Liberal Party, compromising IEA's nonpartisan stance. So going back to what I said about how important it was to the IEA to maintain its nonpartisan status, Smedley was putting that in jeopardy because of his continued ties to the Liberal Party. So Smedley and Fisher actually had a falling out. IEA was disentangled from Smedley in 1959 when IEA was moved out of Smedley's office to a new location at Hobart Place. So up until 1959, the IEA was literally located at Smedley's own office, right? And then when they ditched Smedley, they moved it to a different place, right? So that's how they separated themselves from Oliver Smedley. Fisher was very hands off of the intellectual strategy of IEA and let Harris and Selden handle it themselves. So like Fisher, even though he was the major fundraiser and founder of the think tank, he wasn't very involved in its activities. He left that job to Harris and Selden to figure out, and they were like brilliant at their jobs. IEA blended personnel from both political parties, Harris and Fisher from the Tories, the conservatives in other words, Selden and Smedley from liberals. The result was a new kind of conservatism based on classical liberalism. And then Harris and Selden used their working class origins to paint Keynesianism as elitist. So yeah, this sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier when, neoliberalism kind of resulted in this fusion of liberals and conservatives into like this new force, right? Liberals, like economic liberals, otherwise known as neoliberals. Like this book uses the term economic liberals a lot. It doesn't ever use the term neoliberals, even though I think it should. It just goes with the term economic liberalism. But you have these economic liberals, right, who get frozen out of the Liberal Party, and these conservatives who just join forces to create like this new political entity called the Institute of Economic Affairs. And their goal is not to influence one particular party or another. It's to influence the entire political spectrum, to infect all the political parties currently operating with their ideas. IEA was clearly based on Hayek's principle of intellectual battle over the course of decades. Keynes's quote on academic scribblers was prominently hung on the walls, of IEA. Unlike other traditional think tanks, IEA's task was to evangelize. So I think I went into detail about this on another stream, but Keynes has this magnificent quote about how, like, academic ideas, or ideas in general, have so much more impact in the long run than any amount of like lobbying by special interests. And the actions that politicians take more often than not really have to do with like the works of some academic that they ended up reading and getting influenced by like a couple years before they became politicians, right? So the Keynes has this really magnificent quote where he just says like, politicians usually just get influenced by academic scribblers, and that's how, ideas like are transmitted throughout the world. And this is another example of what I'm talking about when I say neoliberals like frequently like adopt the tactics of their adversaries. Like they read this Keynes quote and they're like, yeah, this guy has it right. Like, even though we hate Keynes, like we understand that he's completely correct about this, and that's exactly why we're going to do the exact same thing. So they hang this Keynes quote on the wall of their own office just to make it so apparent that they're adopting the tactics of their opposition in order to crush their opposition, right? It's a very troll move in a way. A large program of public education on the philosophy of the market economy was IEA's main priority in 1959. The main editorial strategy was to apply classical doctrine to present-day problems. So the IEA's main priority was like to engage in this very robust education campaign to basically take classical liberalism and apply it to modern day problems, and basically try to make people aware that like classical liberalism is like the best lens to view modern problems through. So were there any people arguing against the IEA ideas, or did they completely steamroll and was it too late to stop them? Well, remember this article that I showed you earlier? Right, remember this guy? This is the guy who did that. David Collard. In 1968, this article came out where he said, like, he calls them the new right. He doesn't call them neoliberals. He calls them the new right, which makes sense because the neoliberals are finding their major audience in the Conservative Party. So on the surface, it makes sense that he would characterize them as right. But I mean, a more nuanced understanding would be like, this is a Conservative Party that's being infiltrated by people who are really supposed to be called neoliberals, right? He calls it the new right, which, makes perfect sense in 1968. So yeah, that's what this article is. This article is one of the few examples I've ever actually come across that's actually trying to make a warning about what these people are doing, right? And your question is a good one. But, like I said, that's the only example I've come across so far. Selden thus applied the principles of economic liberalism to as many areas of economic activity as possible. Early topics of pamphlets included pensions and advertising. So, yeah, what Selden did a lot of is he wrote pamphlets on specific industries or topics, and in every single one he would just apply the economic liberal solution, and he would tackle as many different topics as he could, right? He did pensions, he did advertising, he did the press, he did all sorts of different topics. And then IEA's publications were written in simple, accessible language and were short, between roughly 1,000 to 1,500 words, ensuring a wide market. This was something they took from the Fabians, right? This is like the article that we just looked at, right? Like the Fabian tracts, this was modeled off of that. So Selden reiterated to all IEA writers that they must fearlessly indicate conclusions for policy without regard to what may be thought in the short run to be politically impossible. IEA's authors were thus given a license to think the unthinkable. So this is where the book gets its namesake from. And Selden in this quote is reiterating a very Hayekian idea, right? Hayek, one of the major ideas that Hayek got across to all his followers was like, it doesn't matter how hopeless it seems at the moment for us to ever get an audience, right? You just have to operate as if, like, one day we're going to be in power, right? And you have to make the case as confidently as possible, no matter how far away we are from the goal, right? It doesn't matter that we're out of power and no one's listening to us, because one day this Keynesian consensus is going to fail. And at that point, we will have decades of research and policy stockpiled, ready to be picked up at the moment that people lose interest in the current paradigm. And Selden absorbs this point, just like Fisher absorbed that point. So he gives the IEA writers the instructions to like literally make the strongest cases for free market policies, no matter how much ridicule they get, or no matter how much they're ignored, really, because no one in government is really paying attention to them. So IEA's authors were almost exclusively academic economists who had been touched by the teachings of the economic liberals of LSE, Hayek, Robbins, and Plant. So I think on the left here we have a list of people who were writers for the Institute of Economic Affairs, like people who contributed articles to the IEA. And a lot of these guys were students of Hayek, Robbins, and Plant when they were professors at the London School of Economics, which was, for Hayek, it was between like 1931 and 39, or maybe it was longer than that. I don't remember. And then on the right are people who got published in the IEA who actually were Mont Pelerin Society members. So Hayek, Gottfried Haberler, Harry Johnson, James Buchanan, Milton Friedman, Stanley Denison, John Jukes, Lionel Robbins, and Frank Paish. All these guys were certified Mont Pelerin members. Selden also sought authors with Fabian or leftist origins to infiltrate those audiences in reverse. Famous example was Douglas Houghton. I don't really know how to pronounce that guy's last name, or Houghton. So Selden, I don't know if this was the author's words or Selden's words, but he uses this phrase I've never heard before, which is called infiltration in reverse. So what Selden liked to do was he liked to invite Fabians and socialists to actually contribute to the IEA to kind of like deepen the IEA's reputation, even with audiences that would ostensibly be considered adversaries of the IEA. And Selden called this infiltration in reverse, basically inviting your enemies to contribute to your own publication to try and make it seem as though like your ideas have universal appeal, no matter who it is that, no matter what it is that you're talking about, you are appealing to all audiences. And this guy in particular, Douglas Houghton, he was like, I'm struggling to remember what his role was, but he was like one of these guys who was like in the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party, again, is like in the grips of Keynesian demand management policy, right? But he actually goes to the IEA and he writes this article about how public expenditure is actually not good, right? So hearing that from this dude who is from the Liberal Party, that's like a blow. That's like a serious blow to the idea of Keynesian demand management policy, right? And the IEA like invited this guy to contribute an article to IEA, basically making the case against public expenditure, right? So that was their tactic of infiltration in reverse. That's why I get scared by liberals at times more than conservatives. They use our own weapons against us. Yeah, I don't know if you can necessarily throw all liberals into the same basket, because a lot of liberals today don't even understand the origins of the term liberal. So they're not really sophisticated enough to like be a member of a group like this, for example, right? Most people just think that liberal is like synonymous with Democrat, right? And those people might be misinformed, but they're not necessarily dangerous. Like, these people are dangerous in that they understand like how to manipulate language and how to obfuscate the context of the political environment that they're operating in, right? So Selden was actually kind of a genius at this, because like I said, he would not only was his organization like a blending of liberal and conservative individuals, but he was like inviting members of the groups that he was ostensibly like an adversary of to contribute to his publication to give his ideas an even more universal appeal. A major interest of IEA was resurrecting the interest in microeconomics after Keynes swamped the field with macroeconomics. So I mean, yeah, that's a basic fact, right? Because the IEA was against Keynes, it was against government intervention, it was against demand management, and they were against Keynes's emphasis on macro over microeconomics because neoliberals are obsessed with the individuals and the decision of the individual, right? So microeconomics is very important to them. They don't want macroeconomics to be the focus because macroeconomics takes the emphasis off of the individual and onto like institutions like the state. Michael Caine started the call for privatization of industry, starting with telephones in his 1966 IEA paper. British Telecom was privatized by Thatcher in 1984. Right, so you can see that in 1966, someone at IEA made the case for privatizing telephones, and then only like 18 years later, like that actually happened, right? So that should give you an indication that like what these people are saying, despite the fact that it took decades for what they were saying to actually come to fruition, like it did actually come to fruition, right? They were very forward thinking in terms of how far ahead they were making these cases that would one day get picked up by politicians who were supportive of them when the chance actually happened. Two of IEA's most controversial suggestions came from Hayek, reducing trade union power and monetary stability. Friedman was IEA's most persuasive exponent of monetarism. And then these are like two Hayek publications that actually appeared in IEA. So Hayek, he was very hostile to trade unions and trade union power. So this is like not really a surprise. Neoliberals in general consider trade unions to be like trade unions are a big problem to neoliberals because they do two things. One is they push inflation by continuously demanding wage increases. And the other is that they neoliberals believe that trade unions literally constitute a monopoly on labor, right? So no one else, can distribute labor power besides these unions, and that's what makes them a monopoly, right? So like they applied the concept of a monopoly to unions and claimed that unions are like monopolizing labor, basically. IEA is responsible for placing monetarism at the heart of British politics. So monetarism is this economic approach that's really popularized by Milton Friedman, which basically says, like, inflation is a problem that can be solved by controlling the supply of money in society. And by tightly controlling the supply of money, like how much money you're actually printing year after year, you can control inflation. And this idea becomes extremely popular because of Friedman and because of the IEA. And monetarism becomes like all the rage in Britain when IEA like really starts becoming influential in say like the 60s and 70s. All right, only 4 more pages to go. Trade unions were the greatest sacred cow in Britain in the 60s and early 70s. IEA attacked this in 1976 with The Theory of Collective Bargaining by William Hutt. So William Hutt was also on that list of writers that I showed a couple pages back, and the IEA finally attacked trade unions in 1976, which they had been building up towards for a while because, like this bullet point says, trade unions are like the biggest sacred cow in Britain. So like they had to build up to their case against unions for quite some time, right? Like think about this. They made this article in 1976. The IEA was founded in 1955. So they waited like a whole 21 years before actually articulating a major case against unions. So they had to build up to this for a long time. Hayek and Friedman actually disagreed on the significance of monetarism. Hayek considered monetarism a solution only when economic disturbances have monetary causes, which cannot remove disturbances with external causes, like trade unions. So what this bullet point is basically saying is Hayek is not as big of a supporter of monetarism as Friedman is, because Hayek doesn't believe that monetarism is necessarily the solution to economic disturbances if those disturbances are outside of the economic system, right? And what he means by outside of the economic system is like trade unions, for example. Like trade unions are this big disruption in the economic system that has nothing to do with the money supply, right? So when you have a society that's like got a lot of trade unions, like controlling the money supply is not going to make your problems go away, because what's causing the problems in the economy are external, right? They're not caused by how much money is out there. They're caused by these trade unions that are causing all types of trouble. What's kind of interesting about this point is like people use disagreements between Hayek and Friedman on issues like monetarism as evidence of why like Hayek and Friedman were actually significantly different. But like this disagreement between them is like so minor. Like for all intents and purposes, they're like fully on board with the entire project of like rolling back the New Deal and rolling back uh, the shift towards government intervention that takes place at the conclusion of World War II. Like this disagreement is not significant in the grand scheme of things. Like they're very much on board with the political project of neoliberalism. The Center for Policy Studies is responsible for politicizing monetarism under Thatcher. So the Center for Policy Studies is another organization that I'm going to try and tackle in the next episode. And this organization is another organization that kind of gets inspiration from the IEA. And this institution is basically founded for the explicit purpose of just being like a research wing of the Conservative Party, right? The Center for Policy Studies is not nonpartisan like the IEA is. Its explicit purpose is to produce research for the Conservative Party. And it's a huge part of Thatcher's administration when she comes to power. IEA raised the profile of monetarism by arguing Keynesian demand management was inflationary. IEA attacked full employment targets in 1964. This is some excellent note-taking. I feel you're a detective solving a case. Well, that's a great compliment. I appreciate that. But just keep in mind, everything that I wrote down is from this book. Okay? So, this guy is the one who did a lot of the research, right? But I honestly don't quite yet know what this guy's angle is. I think that he is like actually in favor of a lot of this stuff. Like, I'm wondering if maybe in the conclusion of this book, he's going to be like, yeah, this was all great. Like, it was great that all of this stuff happened and economic liberalism came back, and it was just great all around, right? There's some hints in his tone that maybe he's like really happy that all of this happened, but I don't know yet for sure if that's what his angle is. But, even if that's the case, his research is still like really useful. But I mean, this information is not all that hidden. I might be one of the only people who's actually like trying to learn it, and actually spread it, right? But it's not all that hidden. The reputation of monetarism exploded internationally when Friedman addressed the 8th annual meeting of the American Economic Association in 1967. Friedman argued inflation is always a monetary phenomenon and advocated strict control of the money supply. So in 1967, Friedman gives this address to the American Economic Association. And he makes this really, really bold claim, which is that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, right? Like inflation is caused by the rate at which money is being created by the government and injected into society, right? And this is like a very radical claim to make at the moment, because at the moment the contemporary mainstream understanding is that there's this inverse relationship between full employment and inflation, right? So if there's full employment, then inflation will go down, and this relation is called the Phillips curve. And Friedman basically comes out and says like the Phillips curve isn't real. Like what causes inflation is improper control of the money supply. So this is like a very bold claim that he makes in front of all these economists, right? And this is where the reputation of monetarism, like I said, really explodes, is when he makes this case. Friedman argued in his address to AEA that monetary policy in the past had been too late and too much. His address came at a time when inflation was the most serious threat facing Western economies. Friedman therefore became an integral part of IEA's campaign for monetarism, writing many papers and participating in many debates at IEA. So Friedman became like a massive asset to the IEA during this time, and his explanation for why inflation happens was like perfectly timed. right? Because it was during the 1970s that uh, countries all over the world, but especially America and Britain, started to suffer from this thing called stagflation, which was the combination of high inflation and high unemployment, right? And it was this very vexing problem that the Keynesian demand management policies did not know how to deal with, right? And then you have these neoliberals like Friedman stepping into the scene with these very confidently stated solutions, these monetarist solutions. And this is how the Keynesian consensus starts to crumble, because Keynesianism does not have an answer to stagflation, and these neoliberals are claiming that they do, right? That's what makes them super popular at the time. The IEA helped prepare Friedman's TV series Free to Choose in 1980, which had a massive effect on British public opinion. So yeah, if you know what Free to Choose is, you could probably find episodes of it on YouTube. The IEA helped produce that. Alan Walters actually published one of the most influential IEA pieces on monetarism in 1969, Money in Boom and Slump. IEA followed Walters' paper with their most popular paper of all time, The Counter-Revolution in Monetary Theory by Milton Friedman. So the most popular paper that IEA ever published was by Milton Friedman, and it was about monetarism. So that should give you some indication of how important this concept is to neoliberalism in general. Friedman's lecture was attended by future Labor PM James Callaghan, who put control of the money supply high on his agenda in 1976. So James Callaghan, he's a really interesting figure who I believe in a future episode in the neoliberalism series, I'm going to cover him and Jimmy Carter simultaneously, because James Callaghan and Jimmy Carter, are very similar, despite the fact that their initials are both JC, which is kind of a weird coincidence. But like, they are both sort of the last so-called liberal political leaders who operate in an environment that's not neoliberal, right? So Jimmy Carter in the U.S. and James Callaghan in the U.K., these guys are both like the last breath of Keynesianism before neoliberalism completely takes over, right? And they both kind of help neoliberalism get its foot in the door, because like Callaghan, for example, he doesn't really view Keynesian demand management policies as useful as they were in like the 1940s and 50s, right? Because they're facing this huge stagflation problem, and Keynesianism doesn't have an answer to that. And the neoliberals are not necessarily wrong about this. Like, Keynesianism didn't really have an answer for inflation, and that was a huge problem, right? But that doesn't mean that neoliberalism was the solution, right? It just means that Keynesianism was lacking. So IEA presented a dilemma between inflation creating Keynesianism and uncompetitiveness or anti-inflation control of money based on, what does this say? I think the word got cut off there. Oh, trade power reduction. So IEA presented a dilemma between inflation creating Keynesianism and uncompetitiveness or anti-inflation control of money based on trade power reduction. So what this bullet point means is the Conservative Party, which is like essentially a neoliberal Trojan horse at this point, they're presenting the British public with a binary choice, right? You can have inflation and Keynesianism and uncompetitiveness, right? Because Britain is like very uncompetitive compared to all of its, European counterparts. Or you can have these anti-inflationary measures which will require us to like reduce the power of trade unions, right? But we will get rid of inflation, right? So they present this binary choice to the British public and basically force them to choose. Like, do you want this, horrible stagflation and Keynesianism and uncompetitiveness, or do you want this anti-inflation control, which is going to require a reduction in trade union power, right? And this is a major tactic that they use to crush the Keynesian consensus, is by offering this binary choice to the public. Friedman and Walters acknowledged that the gradual adoption of monetarism wasn't based on the force of their intellectual arguments as much as a natural response by policymakers to deteriorating conditions under Keynesianism. So this is a kind of an interesting observation because it kind of makes me wonder if Friedman is actually underselling the the force of their argument, right? Because he's saying in this section that basically like, oh, it wasn't because our arguments were particularly good, it was because Keynesianism was so obviously bad, right? Which is kind of like a glib way of saying like, oh, we weren't really all that influential, don't worry about it. But I think he might be underselling the power of his own argument here because, Friedman and the neoliberals, they had a political program that was decades in the making, right? This was not unscripted. This was not unplanned. Like they had all the intention in the world of crumbling the Keynesian consensus, right? So just claiming that, you know, the fact that politicians were now starting to pick up their solutions was not really a result of them making their case well. It's kind of like underhanded. It's like backhand complimenting yourself in a way. It's kind of a weird way to phrase it. Uh, by the early 1970s, IEA publications were starting to receive significant interest in government circles after being mostly ignored for 20 years. So the 1970s is really when IEA comes to prominence. And remember, 1970 is 15 years after the IEA was founded, right? So it took 15 years of them stockpiling data and research before they actually started to receive significant interest in government circles. But this is precisely why they started receiving so much interest, is because by 1970, when stagflation was becoming a huge problem, they already had 15 years of publications that they had built up, right? So the people who were going into government with the intention of solving the stagflation problem, you know, all of a sudden there's this organization that's been around for 15 years that's just been pumping out, information nonstop. That's criticizing the Keynesian paradigm, right? So this was all according to plan. IEA created a platform for Hayek and Friedman, the two biggest free market advocates of the 1980s. So yeah, IEA was a huge benefit to these two guys in particular, who were like arguably the two most important neoliberals. IEA kept Hayek's name alive during a low ebb in his career that spanned from 1960 to his Nobel Prize in 1974. Friedman got the Nobel in 1976. This cemented IEA's intellectual credibility in the public's eyes. So I want to do maybe an entire episode just on the Nobel Prize, because that prize, like the Institute of Economic Affairs itself, was basically like created for the express purpose of raising the profile of these economists, right? The Nobel Prize in Economics is very different from a lot of the other Nobel Prizes because it was created like a whole 68 years after the rest of the Nobel Prizes, right? The Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences was created in like 68. The rest of them were created in like 1901, right? So, the prize in economic sciences, it's really an outlier in terms of all the Nobel Prizes. And Hayek and Friedman both get it within 2 years of each other, which really makes the IEA into like this super like credible academic force after these prizes are awarded, right? So this is what really cements IEA's legacy as like super academic and super prestigious after these Nobels are awarded to Hayek and Friedman. This is like a total coup of academic prestige in a way. But this earlier part is also important because it says IEA kept Hayek's name alive during a low ebb in his career that spanned from 1960 to 1974. So in 1968, Hayek releases this book called The Constitution of Liberty, which is a really important book for crystallizing a lot of neoliberal beliefs. But Hayek was hoping that this book would get just as much attention as The Road to Serfdom, right? He was really hoping that this book would blow up just like The Road to Serfdom did, but it never did, right? The Constitution of Liberty never got as popular as The Road to Serfdom, and after his book came out, he got super depressed, right? And from 1960 to 1974, he was just like, he was expressing a lot of doubt that his vision of the world would ever come true. And so this was like a very low point in his life, like 60 to 74. It was a very low point in Hayek's life. And it wasn't until he actually was awarded this prize in 74 that his depression like ended, right? And he actually like was feeling really confident again, right? That's a interesting fact that I learned about Hayek. So IEA embodies Hayek's call for refining liberalism into a modern philosophy. This was an extremely important point for the neoliberals because, you know, everything that I've read about the Mont Pelerin Society basically makes it out to be like, you know, the most important thing you could possibly do is to make liberalism a modern philosophy, right? They view liberalism's lack of modernity as a huge problem, right? Because in 1947, when the Mont Pelerin Society has its first meeting, like the reputation of liberalism is in the garbage bin. Like no one gives a shit about liberalism. Like liberalism is basically synonymous with like laissez-faire capitalism in 1947. Like no one wants that. Like everyone at this point has already lived through the Great Depression and World War II, and when they think of laissez-faire capitalism, they're like, no, thank you. Like fuck liberalism. And the IEA and the Mont Pelerin Society and Hayek, they viewed their main project in life as like resuscitating liberalism and making it modern again. One of the only major acknowledgments of this development in liberalism was actually a Fabian article called The New Right, a Critique by David Collard in 1968. This is the article that we already looked at. So the article that I showed you with the Incredible Hulk on the cover, talking about, you know, the new right, this is where I learned about that article. All right, this is the last page, I think. Collard warned the left that the IEA was already being taken seriously and outflanking the left while they carried on with abstract conversations about nationalization and how far economic controls should go. So this is one of the only guys I've ever come across who actually made this case to leftists that, you know, the right is resurging, you know, with this super academic, super rigorous research that they're producing at an alarming rate, right? And this is one of the few guys that I feel like really noticed this and really tried to warn everyone what was going on, but I don't think that he was really heeded, right? And it kind of makes sense because the development of neoliberalism is so like convoluted, right? Because to portray the situation accurately requires so much nuance. It's like this fusion of conservatives and liberals who decide that they're going to make this new like concatenation of politics that's nonpartisan but is going to influence all of politics simultaneously. It's like how do you actually summarize this adequately in 1968? It must have been a super difficult task to even try to do, right? It's even hard to do today, and it's like 40 years after it fucking happened, right? So there's nothing simple about actually explaining how this occurred. So that was the notes for chapter 4, and as you can see, chapter 4 had like a shitload of detail in it, and I have a feeling that all the chapters in the book are going to be like this from now on. So I don't think that I'll be able to actually read on stream anymore, which is kind of a shame because I like doing that, but at the same time, like I'm kind of into the thick of the book now, and I don't think that I'll be able to actually produce notes in a timely manner if I'm actually reading on stream. So I'm gonna have to find something else to do on my streams in the coming weeks, and just take my notes off stream. During my research, I recently picked up a copy of Economics in One Lesson. Oh, it's funny you should mention that. So I know about that book, Economics in One Lesson. It's written by Henry Haslet, right? Is that the author? Haslet is one of the guys that I'm going to try and bring up in the next neoliberalism episode. And yeah, that book was very influential. Haslet was probably one of the most influential neoliberal journalists there was. He was very integral to the founding of the Foundation for Economic Education and all kinds of other research. I'm a glutton for punishment. Yeah, Haslet did write that book and was a founding board member of the Mises Institute. Yeah, so you know about him. Okay. Yeah, I hope that this episode coming up will be the episode where I finally mention his name in more detail, that is. I did some drafting of a potential script of part 6, and I ended up greatly expanding the scope of the episode beyond just the think tanks. So now I think this next episode is just gonna try to be a basket for like the whole like organization of the whole global movement in that time period, and it's going to include the think tanks, it's going to include the Nobel Prize, it's going to include some books, it's going to include some private universities, some research, maybe some Mont Pelerin Society meetings. It's going to be a shitload of detail to cram into one video, but I think that this will actually move the series along quite a bit if I'm successful, and it will kind of like speed us up to approaching the later half of the 20th century, which is like pretty overdue at this point. He was also an editor of the American Mercury, precursor to the National Review. Yeah, dude, Haslet was fucking everywhere. He wrote in Newsweek, he wrote in New York Times, he wrote for the Washington Journal. He was literally like one of the most prolific journalists of that period, which is like was kind of a serious problem when you look back on it. Like the fact that this guy had such an insanely big readership, and he was published in like virtually every single huge American publication, like without any pushback whatsoever. Like he's like the prototypical neoliberal journalist, I think. I'm not sure if there's anyone who comes before him. H.L. Mencken was his longtime friend and compatriot for years, and believe offered him the American Mercury job. Mencken was the co-founder. Yeah, Mencken, he was actually very influential on Aaron Director too, the guy who worked at the Free Market Study in Chicago. Will there ever be a segment or episode regarding the split between neoliberal and the gold standard uncapped crowd? I don't know what gold standard uncapped means, but if you mean the unlinking of gold to the dollar, that is for sure going to get mentioned in an episode that's going to be specifically about the stagflation crisis. And I believe the neoliberals viewed that favorably, the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. So I don't think I'm familiar with the split that you're referring to, though. Those are the Tories. Are you saying the Tories were in favor of the gold standard and neoliberals were not? That might be the case. Although by the time Bretton Woods is collapsing, the neoliberals are basically taking over the British Conservative Party. They're kind of like the same. Although Attlee is one of these governments where, like, I had never heard it put this way before, but I was reading about the Attlee ministry, and it said, like, the Labour Party fell out of power primarily because they had literally exhausted all of their goals, right? Which is kind of crazy to think about. Like, if your government is so successful that you get replaced literally because you did everything, right? Normally you would think, like, traditional wisdom would suggest that if you're really successful at everything that you promised to do, that you would get reelected. But it almost made it seem like Attlee was so successful that people just didn't feel the need to elect Labour again, which is like a really weird concept. All right, I think this is going to be the best that we get in terms of this scheme right here. I really should be working up here, though. This is where I'm trying to get to. So what I think I'm going to do now, I'm going to try and use this timeline to sort of build up exactly what I want to talk about in terms of like getting everything chronological, because there's going to be a lot of info to cram into this next episode, and I kind of need to make sure I get all my ducks in a row. The other thing I was talking about, neoliberal and ANCAPs fight over gold because anarcho-capitalists believe gold is the only legitimate currency exchange / model. Oh, I understand what you're saying now. I'm not really familiar with the anarcho-capitalist position. The whole, like, just the name anarcho-capitalist kind of seems like an oxymoron to me. It just says 1938. It doesn't say, like, the specific date that it was founded. That's so weird. This is a decent article, though. Maybe I should try to capture this. So I'm just going to put 1938. Fuck it. Oh, wait. I already have it here. Look at that. I'm so psychic. My prior self was already thinking about this. A good topic of this video would be like going into even more detail about the conflation of neoliberalism with libertarianism. Because this era is where you get all these institutions, right, like Institute of Humane Studies, that refer to themselves as libertarian, but for all intents and purposes are neoliberal. Right, so I could get into a little bit more detail about that in this episode. This is some revolting shit right here. Christ. Okay. What was I looking for again? When was this shit actually founded? With this in mind, Keith Joseph originally wanted the think tank to study the social market economy, naming it the Ludwig Erhard Foundation. Huh, so this think tank was actually originally meant to be more ordoliberal, but I think it just became a research arm of the Conservative Party. Wow, this is actually very specific. The Svergus Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, 1976. So the prize on its face is named after a fucking bank, right? And it never clicked for people that this is not a real prize. Like, you won't even say the real date that this happened on, dude. It's so annoying. Okay, 9th of October. This is a press release, actually. Actually, this press release is super important. I should probably copy this. Okay. Authoritative people and outlets just call it the Nobel Prize in Economics, which gives it an air of legitimacy. Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right about that. That was the whole point, really. Like, the creation of this prize in the first place was a huge coup of academic prestige for the field of economics. And you'll probably hear me say that line specifically in the video when I get to it. But I mean, if you look at the page of this Nobel Prize website, it's literally called the Svergus Riksbank Prize in memory of Alfred Nobel, right? It's not all that hidden that the prize is named after a fucking bank, right? That's like a basic, like, on its face, this should be a red flag. Like, how do you have an economic sciences prize named after a fucking bank? So this guy was also Chicago trained, although he went to go, eventually he moved to Virginia to go work at George Mason. And Nancy MacLean has written a book on this guy called Democracy in Chains. It was very popular. Although she kind of treats this guy as if he's like the sole mastermind, when in reality I think he was just a foot soldier. Like, he was a follower of Hayek and Mises and stuff. He was not really the whole mastermind behind the corporate takeover of the United States. He was very influential, though. He was one of the primary originators of this idea called public choice theory, which is another part of neoliberal ideology that I'm going to hope to get into in this next episode. Hi folks, I'm late. What did I miss? Hi Andy, glad you could join us. So I've spent the majority of the stream building up this timeline document that I've been working on for quite some time. I'm trying to get the chronological sequence of events down for the next episode. I made a new outline here on the right, which you can see, and now I'm just like trying to place all of these different components on a comprehensive timeline that will allow me to just view the whole period at a glance. But what we're doing right now specifically is we are looking at all these recipients of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, and we are taking the press releases that came out. A lot of these dudes were all Chicago dudes. Like, this list of Nobel Prize winners right here, it's very Mont Pelerin Society heavy, and it's very Chicago heavy. These press releases are really going to be really useful documents in the future, I think, because, you know, this article, this press release, this is kind of like the Nobel Foundation's justification for why this person deserves a prize, right? And when you contrast that with the history of this prize and why it even exists in the first place, there's a lot to pick apart here, right? Because this prize was created in 1968. It was created 67 years after the first Nobel Prizes were created, right? It's over half a century younger than the actual Nobel Prizes, right? So a Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences gets created in 1968. And then within the intervening, 30 or 40 years, you have like, what is this? Like 8 or 9 of these Mont Pelerin Society dudes winning the prize within like a 30-year period. Chicago Bros again. So did they just make this Nobel Prize as a way to legitimize the whole neoliberal economic scheme? Well, I'm not sure if they played any role in the actual creation of the prize. The the role for who created the prize is primarily these people. So the Central Bank of Sweden is who's primarily responsible for the creation of the economic prize. And I actually have a book sitting here that's all about this specific topic. It's called The Nobel Factor, The Prize in Economics, Social Democracy, and the Market Turn. So this book goes into all the detail about how the prize in economic sciences was actually created. And if we look in the appendix, I'm sure we will see a lot of references to this bank. Okay, Riksbank, Sweden, references all the way from page 42 to 221. So yeah, the creation of the prize is definitely a story that I'm going to try and tell, or that I'm going to try and fit into this episode. This episode is going to be jam-packed with fucking detail, although I've been trying to build up to this for like quite a bit, so I think it's better to just try to stuff as much detail as I can into this episode so that we could actually like move closer to the present day, or like the late 20th century at least. Nobel Prizes. Let's just look at the timeline for a second. So all these blue labels are the ones that are dealing specifically with the upcoming episode. The orange ones deal primarily with the last episode, and the other colors are just to differentiate them from other topics, right? But this light blue color, this is, the content of the upcoming episode, right? So we put a lot of these labels down today in this section, or in this stream, I mean. For the video, are you going to put down the links to the books and link sources you researched? That would be dope. Well, when it comes to like links and sources and documents and stuff, I am offering that specifically to patrons, right? As an incentive for people to join Patreon. When the video is actually published on YouTube, I mean, I might throw in a citation of like where I got it, but I'm not going to link it to you, or give you access to the document itself unless you're a patron of mine. Like, I feel like that's part of the incentive and the reward that you get for supporting me, is that I will make these sources specifically available for you. But yeah, I mean, this document that I just made today with these press releases, I could see myself sharing that with the Dropbox after the stream is over, or maybe I will just do it on stream. Part of a series on libertarianism. See, this is how political obfuscation happens. This should say neoliberalism. So these private universities, that's also something that we could get into. So this is an interesting topic because the private universities, were very strongly embraced by the neoliberal movement. And in fact, the University of Buckingham, which is in Britain, was the very first private university in Britain, and it was founded by Ralph Harris and Arthur Selden, who both ran the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Thatcher herself, right? So keep that in mind. Neoliberals literally created the very first private university in Britain, and there's this other university in Guatemala that's founded in the early 70s. And this university, if you've never heard of it, is like a shrine to neoliberalism. Like, let me just show you this Wikipedia page for a second. So let me just give you a rundown of what this place is like. The Ludwig von Mises Library has 100,000 visitors annually. Okay, so there's a collection of private libraries of prominent intellectuals and collectors. The prominent intellectuals they mention are virtually all neoliberal or libertarian in outlook. William Hutt was studied at the LSE under Hayek. Gordon Tullock is a close partner of James Buchanan at George Mason. Sir Alan Walters, an economic advisor to Margaret Thatcher. The Henry Haslet Center coordinates the course of economic process and social philosophy, Hayek in the Austrian School in parentheses. The Center for the Study of Capitalism was founded in 2009. The New Media Department specializes in streaming audio and video conferences in English and Spanish on topics related to classical liberal thought, such as Milton and Rose Friedman's Free to Choose series in Spanish, James Buchanan's conference on the opening of Latin America's first public choice center, Vernon L. Smith's honorary doctorate ceremony. We just looked at this guy. By the way, he got his Nobel Prize in 2002. Interview of Milton and Rose Friedman for the 2002 Mont Pelerin Society General Meeting. Traditions and landmarks. Following Manuel Ayau, this is the guy who founded the university. He's a Mont Pelerin member. Honoring the champions of freedom, it has awarded honorary doctorates to scientists, intellectuals, businessmen, artists, and others who have contributed to the sciences, the world of business, and the cause for freedom. 4 Nobel Prize winners have accepted an honorary doctorate awarded by the university: Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, James Buchanan, and Vernon L. Smith. So this university literally bestowed honorary doctorates upon these guys and then referred to them as Nobel Prize winners, even though I think were the doctorates given before or after the prizes were given. This guy wrote for Heritage. I just read this guy's name in Wikipedia like a couple minutes ago. This guy was a Republican senator. Arnold Harberger, this is a Chicago guy who was also involved in the Pinochet coup. Leonard Read, founder of the Foundation of Economic Education. Henry Haslet, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Peter Bauer, this guy's from the LSE, he also worked at the Institute of Economic Affairs. William Hutt, also from LSE. Edwin Fulner, this guy runs the Heritage Foundation. Anthony Fisher, founder of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Israel Kirzner. I'm not as familiar with this guy, but his name pops up again and again in my readings. Alan Walters, we just read this guy's name. Gordon Tullock. Arthur Selden, this is the lead editor of the Institute of Economic Affairs. James Buchanan, who we've already been talking about. Edward Crane, founder of the Cato Institute. Vernon Smith, we just looked at this guy. John Blundell, this guy ran the IEA starting in the 90s, I'm pretty sure. How long does this list fucking go, man? Like, Jesus. They just hand out these honorary doctorates like they're fucking candy to, like, all of their own allies, right? This is exactly how neoliberals operate. You create this university out of thin fucking air, and then you just hand out doctorates like they're fucking candy to whoever, like, to all your friends. Always had a saying, neoliberalism is just libertarianism with the decency to be ashamed of Alex Jones. That's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. I guess neoliberals do have this, this need to, like, you know, engage in civility and decorum. But I mean, I never heard of these institutes before. You would think these places would be well known, like Harvard University, etc. Yeah, you would think, but, you know, I mean, look, they even have a Henry Hazlitt quote right on this banner. So, like, yeah, what was the original point of this? It was to show that this university This university in Guatemala, founded in 1971 by a Mont Pelerin guy, this is like a neoliberal shrine, right? Listen to this, okay? Hayek's bust, a literal bust of Hayek's face, was awarded. Uh, okay, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1974, but Hayek's bust, uh, he his bust is located at the Ludwig von Mises Library. Okay, the library is named after Ludwig von Mises. Okay, Mises's bust. This is not even a complete sentence. Why are you starting off the sentence like this? His bust was donated by the class of 1975 by the School of Business. 1975 is only 4 years after this university was created. Recipients of honorary degrees. See, look, this is a much more concise list than what I just went through. I went to the actual website, but here they show you. You know, all of these people got degrees, right? For no other reason than the university just decided they wanted to hand them out. Like, look, even Peter Thiel has one. So yeah, this is how neoliberals confer prestige onto themselves. They literally create a university and then just give them the degrees for no work. So yeah, I mean, even the dates that these people receive their honorary degrees could be put on this timeline. That would be a lot of fucking work, though. I don't know if I'm going to do that today. I at least need to put the founding of this university on there. So this university was founded in 1971. Of course, it's not going to give me a specific date because, like, no one ever does that anymore. Oh yeah, this this article actually starts off with one of the most hilarious sentences I've ever read on a Wikipedia page. It says, it was founded in 1971 by Manuel F. Ayau, known as Muso. This guy was a Mont Pelerin Society member. Its namesake is Francisco Marroquin, an early bishop of Guatemala and translator of Central American languages, but the university does not follow any of his teachings or philosophies. So it's like, yeah, sure, just name your university after this great guy. And then the Wikipedia page says, but the university does not follow any of his teachings or philosophies. Like, that shit cracked me up the first time I read it. So I guess I'm just gonna put 1971. That's not helpful. This has got to have more information about when they were actually founded. Look, it's like a Hayek quote right on the front banner of the homepage. It's like, dude, fuck off. Look, Ludwig von Mises quote. It's like this place is literally, this is like synthetic academia. Kerzner Entrepreneurship Center, David Hume Ethics Center, Capitalism Study Center, Henry Haslet Center, Vernon Smith Center. These are not academics. These are evangelists. Okay, I'm trying to figure out when this place was actually fucking founded. 50 years. History of the UFM. Okay, this is what I might need. What stands out at UFM is that all its students are familiar with the ideas of economists such as Ludwig von Mises, Henry Haslet, F.A. Hayek, Adam Smith, or Karl Menger. Listen to this. The success of the Fabian Society convinced CES members that educating the influential elite was the most important initiative in the country's march towards its destination. Is that not what I've been fucking saying for my whole series? That this is exactly what they do? Educating the influential elite? When the fuck has educating the influential elite been an academic's role in society? You would expect them not to be like so on the nose with being like, yeah, this is what we do. We influence the elite to reshape society along anti-democratic like lines. In 1971, it still doesn't give a fucking date. It was founded as the University College at Buckingham in 1973. It was granted university status by Royal Charter in 1983. I wonder what that means. So in 1973 as a university college, and then 1983 as a real university. I think I'm just going to say 1973 is the real founding. Buckingham was closely linked to Margaret Thatcher, who as Education Secretary oversaw the creation of the University College in 1973, and as Prime Minister was instrumental in elevating it to a university in 1983. Its development was influenced by the Libertarian Institute of Economic Affairs, in particular Harry Ferns and Ralph Harris, heads of the institute. In keeping with its adherence to a libertarian philosophy, the university's foundation stone was laid by Margaret Thatcher, who would also later be the university's chancellor. So yeah, this is just another one of these universities that was like created out of thin air for the sole purpose of validating their research coming out of think tanks. It is the oldest of Britain's independent universities? How the fuck is that true? Britain has universities that are like 500 years old. This was founded in 73. Are you fucking kidding me right now? One of the oldest British independent universities. It wasn't even an independent university until 1983, right? It started off as a university college. You're telling me that 1983 constitutes one of the oldest British independent universities? It still is not going to tell me. Okay, wait, hold on. A suitable site was found in Buckingham, and on 29th of March 1973, the University College at Buckingham was incorporated. Okay, so this gives me something to go on. 29th of March 1973. That's good PR right there. I mean, dude, it's not hard to be involved in public relations when you just make shit up constantly. I think that's what everyone's realizing in the 21st century. These were like the original grifters. Okay? The neoliberals are what made, it possible to like live your whole life, your whole career being a fucking grifter. People think that like the Republicans invented this shit. Nah, man, it comes from these guys. So there are a lot of individuals I want to mention in this upcoming episode, and like demonstrating what all these individuals contributed to the spread of neoliberalism is definitely going to be complicating, right? But I hope that by at least giving each of these people even a brief mention, it will illustrate like how like thorough this network was. Like all these guys knew each other. They were all on the same page, basically. All right, so if you look at the articles folder on Dropbox, you will see that there is a new document that says History of AEI. That was basically a copy paste of an article that I found earlier from Wikipedia, and then the Nobel Prize press releases. That's all the press releases that I took from the Nobel Prize website on how many different guys? That was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 winners of the Nobel Prize. I got their press releases from the Nobel website. And yeah, I'm gonna try and make some progress before the next week's stream, just so that there's a lot more on this timeline that we can speak about, and maybe I will get close to actually having like a written draft that I could actually record. But that's often the hardest step for me in the creation of these videos. So I'm not saying I'm gonna get it done in a week, but maybe I will start. Maybe I will take the first step towards getting that actual recording script written. How's the reading going? The reading has taken a backseat to actually writing a script in the past week, and that's actually what you can see here on the left side is my first draft of my script. It's about 3,800 words. The goal is to get to like 8,000 words, something like that. So this is nowhere near complete, but it's my first draft that I started a couple days ago. I also uploaded this to Google Docs, so if you want to actually see this for yourself, I believe you can just go to this link. But anyway, yeah, this is my current draft of part 6, and I think that I will try to keep it going today. I did make some good progress yesterday and the day before that. I'm still amazed by how useful my writing from years ago still is. A lot of times I start off with like a couple pages because back in like 2018 when I wrote the very first episode of the series, I actually wrote the drafts of like 8 episodes, right? I had like 8 drafts ready to go, and those drafts still really come in useful when it's time to start a new one, but of course it ends up becoming something completely different by the time I actually get done with it. I think Anthony Fisher has some great quotes that I could include. I think if I open up the old book here, I'll probably be able to find some good stuff. So here there's a really great quote by Anthony Fisher that I think I'm going to include. Let's see if I have to do anything to lead into this. Thinkable. Richard Cockett. Page 123 to 124. Hi, Gus. How's it going today? I'm getting ready to go get my coronavirus vaccine. That's why I'm late. Hey, that's great news, man. Congratulations. No worries on being late. I actually got my first shot back on. I'm struggling to remember what day it was, but it was some day earlier this month, and then I have another appointment on the 6th of May, and that'll be my second shot, and then I think I will be done after that. So yeah, on the 6th I'm getting my second shot, which I'm excited about. So good for you, man. So with all this info, was Hayek the main one pushing for classical liberalism during his time, and then others morphed it into neoliberalism? Well, I'd say you have to be careful, like, when you're using the terms classical liberalism and neoliberalism, because these guys, they love classical liberalism, right? And they always call themselves classical liberals, and they always say that what they're trying to popularize is classical liberalism, right? But in practice, what they're espousing is something completely new and different. So you have to be able to read whenever they say classical liberalism that it really means something different, right? Because classical liberalism would not have as much emphasis on the strong state as neoliberals put on the strong state, right? Neoliberals assert that you literally need to engage in the process of, going into government and capturing it for the explicit purpose of making it strong and making its only function to preserve the competitive order, right? A normal classical liberal would not put such an emphasis on having a strong state. So these guys often claim that what they're all about is classical liberalism, but in practice they have instituted something quite different. Just got my second shot yesterday, so I'm fully vaccinated. Hey, that's great news, Andy. Congratulations. I hope that I will be there soon. I mean, what you're really supposed to do is, like, after you get your second shot, you're supposed to wait another 2 weeks before really starting to get back out into public. Because it takes 2 weeks for the vaccine to like percolate throughout your body, I guess you could say. So yeah, maybe by like the 3rd or 4th week of May, I will be like going out again and doing stuff, which will be really nice. It's been like 14 months of house arrest going on. Unfortunately, it's Pfizer, and I wanted the Johnson & Johnson. Well, Johnson & Johnson was cool because you only needed one shot and you were done, but honestly, Pfizer is probably the strongest. So I think you're actually the most protected from symptoms of coronavirus with Pfizer. So right now I'm trying to figure out how to include Oliver Smedley, who is a early partner of Anthony Fisher, and he's a minor character, but he's an important character. Oliver Smedley. So the reason why I'm holding this book in the first place is because someone in the chat said Oliver Smedley, right? And I looked at that name on Wikipedia, and that's how I found this book, right? So that's just goes to show how even one little piece of info can lead to learning a lot. Yeah, I heard that too. Crazy how it's all going downhill faster over in India, but I guess they're the same like Brazil now. Thankfully, we dodged a bullet having Biden around. Yeah, it really does feel like that. Although, I don't know. I mean, yeah, we dodged a bullet for sure, but it's sort of like the bullet is just like stuck in midair. It's still going to keep traveling if we mess up again in the future. So one idea that's really interesting that I kind of want to get across in this video is that the reason why neoliberalism exists in this like weird abstract zone between liberal and conservative is kind of because of the fact that liberal parties and left-wing parties across the world were into Keynesian economics and government intervention and all this stuff. And in a lot of these countries, you have people who belong to these liberal parties who actually weren't in favor of this at all, right? They consider themselves classical liberals, and so these classical liberals who belong to these liberal parties that are all about Keynesianism, they feel, excuse me, they feel like left out, like they've been frozen out of their party, and that their party is like not, going in the right direction. So sometimes these classical liberals who felt frozen out of their parties would either go join the conservative parties or they would go work with these neoliberals. And the neoliberals took in people from both the liberal and conservative parties, meaning it was sort of like a bipartisan collaboration that, sort of defied definition, right? And in this episode, we're going to talk a lot about think tanks, and think tanks are kind of like where this bipartisan collaboration around neoliberalism happened, right? You have members of conservative parties and members of liberal parties who call themselves classical liberals, who are just not into Keynes at all, come together and form this new body of knowledge that doesn't define itself as like liberal or conservative. It just defines itself as like for liberty and for markets and for freedom, right? And especially in places like Britain and America, like these people kind of defied categorization because of how they were like, sitting outside the, they were on the outside of politics looking inwards, right? And they were really like not trying to pigeonhole themselves. It's kind of interesting. And then as a result, their ideas were like mislabeled and poorly understood, which actually made them more powerful as time went on. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of info in this video that I've been trying to get to for quite a long time. I'm like slowly like scraping through this early 20th century stuff, and now we're like in the middle of the century, and hopefully from here on out it will be like accelerating towards the present day. But I mean, I kind of underestimated how fascinating this early 20th century history really is. Oh, this guy, okay, so this quote that I just found, I've read this before, but it perfectly explains what I just said. Okay, it says, however, the Liberal Party, talking about the British Liberal Party, the Liberal Party leadership refused to contemplate even this comparatively small step in the direction of economic liberalism, meaning classical liberalism, which meant that the economic liberals of the Liberal Party, spurned by the party which they thought was their natural and historical home, eventually turned to the IEA instead. That stands for Institute of Economic Affairs. That's the neoliberal think tank that gets founded in 1955. A recent historian of the Liberal Party has written that the Liberals had the Liberals listened to Smedley, Grant, Chester, Peacock, et al., the party would have certainly have acquired a distinctive position and would have been recognized as forerunners of the new right in the 1970s. This meant, as Andrew Gamble has written, that one major feature of recent British politics is that when the revival of liberal political economy did come about, it was the Conservative Party which it was associated and not the Liberal Party. So economic liberalism and liberal economics diverged to add to the confusion of political terminology. The liberals, on the whole, chose to remain with Keynesianism and the perspectives of social liberalism. That they did so was partly because of the radical individualists, such as Smedley of the 1950s, who would have purged the party of its social liberalism. Wait, what does that say? That they did so was partly because of the radical individualists of the 1950s who would have purged the party of its social liberalism, never made much headway. That's a weird sentence construction. They were resisted by the party establishment, who did not want to see the liberals staking out political ground too distant from the consensus policies which the two main parties were pursuing. They were resisted also by the radical reform group, which believed the task of the liberals was not to retreat from social liberalism, but to propose ways in which the institutions and policies of the welfare state and the managed economy could be improved and strengthened. This meant state action to redistribute wealth and decentralize power. In 1956, the party acquired a leader who inclined to the views of the radical reform group, Joe Grimmond. So basically, the second half of that quote was kind of not necessary, but the first part is explaining exactly what I'm talking about. Economic liberalism basically evacuated the liberal parties, right? And they went to the conservatives or to the neoliberals, right? So when economic liberalism, i.e. classical liberalism, came back, it came from the conservative angle and the neoliberal angle, right? The liberal parties kind of like purged themselves of economic liberalism, of classical liberalism, right? So you have this confusing terminology where like economic liberalism or liberal political economy, as this book says, actually is not originating in the liberal parties anymore. It's actually originating in either conservative national politics or in neoliberal think tank organizations, right? Which means, you know, the traditional terminology of like liberal and conservative is really not describing the situation properly anymore, which is a point that I've made, I think, several times over the past couple of years. Well, I guess that's why Reagan and Thatcher paired up then and became part of this scheme too. They were, I don't know, that's a great point. I mean, I'm trying to sort of decide in my head whether they paired up after they came to power or they like were already quite aware of each other before they even were elected to public office. Because they're both true believers in these guys like Hayek and Friedman. Like Reagan and Hayek are both like major Hayek fans, and they had to know this about each other. And I think that their familiarity with these ideas goes way before they actually were elected to be heads of state. I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I think it's likely that they knew of each other before that they got into power, but definitely when they were in power, they looked at each other and they were like, okay, we're both part of the same thing. Like we're definitely both part of the same movement, you know, and that's super powerful. What's up, Barack? How goes the research? Hey, Michael, glad you could be here today. So today I'm actually working on a draft of part 6. I have a working draft that I've started, and right now I'm just tuning it up. I'm about to include a fucking massive block quote that's gonna be really good. So let me just make sure that I've got this down. This has got to be one of the juiciest quotes I've ever put in a video. Like, is this not is this not the most like mind control type of shit you've ever heard? It is of course necessary to have political machinery, but if we are going to increase the number of people who are prepared to vote intelligently, we must start wait, did I type that right? We must start putting the right ideas in front of them at an early age. Therefore, the Institute of Economic Affairs has been formed to propagate sound economic thought in the universities and all other educational establishments where we find it possible to do so. Like, what? Quotes like this might be my favorite part of writing a video, because when you find a quote or like quotes like this one, it's like the script just starts writing itself, because these people are just explaining in their own words how big of fuckheads they are. You know? I don't even have to expend any energy. Just let these fucking idiots do it for me. Listen to these fucking dudes talk, dude, I swear. The problem with this episode is I could make it all about the Institute of Economic Affairs if I wanted to, but I actually wanted to make it like way more comprehensive and actually include a bunch of different organizations and universities and prizes and stuff like that. Like, I actually want to go into detail about the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in this episode. I want to go into detail about some Chicago philosophy or some ideology that came out of Chicago. I want to go into some universities, some private universities that were established to spread neoliberalism. I kind of want this episode to be like a basket that has like all this activity in it. But the story of how the Institute of Economic Affairs was created is probably the centerpiece of the episode so far. Kind of because it's like the first thing that occurs in the middle of the 20th century that kind of sets off this entire cascade of activity, right? The founding of this think tank is kind of what starts the race towards neoliberalism. And the reason why this think tank is so important is it's not just because they published a bunch of research and stuff like that. Like this this think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, which still exists by the way in Britain, the model of this think tank was basically a blueprint for all the other think tanks that came afterwards. So for example, like the Heritage Foundation in America, the Cato Institute in America, the Adam Smith Institute, the Center for Policy Studies, all of these think tanks were like clones of IEA. And I'm pretty sure some of the people who founded these think tanks like basically straight up refer to them as clones of IEA. And this is a book where I learned this in, so let's see if I can find some proof of what I'm talking about. So with the help of Murray Rothbard, Crane started the Cato Institute in the Bay Area of San Francisco in 1977. As Crane tells it, Charles Koch was a lot smarter than me. He knew that I myself would eventually move the think tank back here to Washington, D.C., which I did in 1981. Cato was also influenced by the British IEA and the ideological crusades of Anthony Fisher. Though Fisher was not directly involved in its establishment, the Cato Institute worked very closely with Fisher's Atlas Foundation, the international umbrella organization for neoliberal think tanks that Fisher had set up. Crane suggests that the Cato Institute is the closest clone of the IEA of all of the free market think tanks in the United States. So here you can see the founder of the Cato Institute, Ed Crane, literally saying that his own think tank, the Cato Institute, is the closest clone of the IEA, right? Which means the IEA is literally the blueprint for all the organizations that follow, right? Including this Atlas Foundation, which was also founded by Anthony Fisher. So it's like they just made this blueprint for a type of organization that they could just proliferate across the world, right? And then just drown everyone else out with the volume of research that they produced and the amount of collaboration that they could produce between them. Can't wait for the video. It looks like things are going smoothly. They're going a lot more smoothly than it was going a couple weeks ago. A couple weeks ago, I could just not build up the energy or the courage to like actually start a script. And then this week I finally bit the bullet and it's been going pretty quickly. So yeah, maybe that's because I'm like finally getting my vaccine and I can like view the end of the tunnel of like being on house arrest. But But yeah, I'm actually pretty surprised and pleased with my progress on this script so far. I think in the best world possible, I would have this episode completely done and published on like June 1st. I don't know if that's going to happen though. That's like the best case scenario. I would have to work every single day to make that possible. But that's a good goal to have. I think the second best goal would be July 1st. June 1st if I'm a beast, July 1st if I, take my time. It was a worthwhile stream even though I was late. Good job. Hey, thanks, Cameron. I appreciate that compliment, and I'm glad that you could be here. But anyways, thank you all for being in the stream today. Thank you for watching me just like stare at my word processor for 2 hours. It's really cool that I can do that, and that you guys will be here and keep me company. And it's been fun. Thanks for joining the weekly stream. I hope that I'll see you next week. And let me know what you think about the script. I will continue working on it next week, and then we will have even more to discuss next Sunday, hopefully. But anyways, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your Sunday afternoon.